Well, good morning. This is a fourth video on Life Enhancement Training, L.E.T, program I designed this summer, and I'm now teaching a course on it. And I just wanted to share some of where the background comes for this course and some very practical tips on how to use the Life Enhancement Training, what it means to me. So this is mainly for the L.E.T students, but again, anyone could be interested in it, and I encourage you to look at any of the 3 videos prior to this to align with and get a better understanding of the context where I'm coming from. Let me start with something very simple, that is right now we are in a society that, in Canada anyway, and I know in other places where, Truth and Reconciliation, the TRC Commission came out and had us as a society come to try to acknowledge the truth. I love that. And then the hard part was, what does reconciliation really mean? And we were particularly, as a country in Canada, looking at how do we do this as a healing process. We talk about that word. I wonder how many people actually know what that means. Perhaps some of the original thinking of the indigenous worldview and people who hold to that traditional worldview, they certainly will know a lot about healing. But I approached the L.E.T program with a particular healing perspective, which I will talk about sometimes under liberation peer counseling, under sometimes what I just call the natural healing approach that we are all inherently gifted with. Again, in my other videos, you'll get a sense of what that means. So Truth and Reconciliation, to me, is not just about, quote, giving the rights back to Indigenous peoples and paying for and reconciling with the oppression that has gone down on that First Peoples around the world. But just again, I'll speak in Canada as that's my context. So what is the problem from one perspective and a life enhancement training perspective that I take? Well, I take the perspective that, yes, we've actually not only just about completely destroyed Native people, but when I say we, I'm really talking about the dominant Western worldview and the peoples who have been like my ancestors and even myself have benefited from that Western worldview of domination, control, and more or less the destruction of the natural world, as we have attempted to build and secure ourselves as the dominant winners of the planet, and are now seeing that with mass extinctions and with global warming that we've enhanced and created by our uncaring and unthoughtful ideas about how to live as a lifestyle and the technologies and sciences that go with that. Not all bad, for sure, but have now shown us that we are going to be facing a lot of very severe consequences, as I've talked about. And there's rebellion movements like Extinction Rebellion moving around the world rapidly right now, is driven by a lot of youth, which is great. Suggesting that, we're going to rebel to this destruction of the natural. We're going to tell the truth. And Extinction Rebellion as a movement, which you can look up on the internet, also says, let's tell the truth to the people. That's one of the biggest problems. We've lied. And in some sense, we've broken the social contract of truth and honesty, just like we broke the contract of the treaties that were often offered and were negotiated, and sometimes with good intentions, perhaps, not always. And all of it boils down to, from my perspective, is that we have not achieved a nonviolent society, and we have hurt feelings everywhere, and that's why feelings is underlined here, and it's harmed our cooperation. That is our ability to tell the truth and reconcile and be a society with some unity and direction in terms of moral and, I say, healing perspective. So L.E.T's model talks about moving from a coping culture to a healing culture. That's the revolution I teach and I'm focused on, and wanted to let you know that just quickly, there are some sources of this change, this exciting idea of paying attention to hurt feelings. And this is not just some pop psychology, oh, let's listen to our feelings and share our feelings and then everything will be fine. Because whether it's truth and reconciliation with the planet, its ecology, or with the native First Peoples, no, it's not just sitting around sharing your feelings that's going to make it work and make it better. So feelings is something that is very important in the L.E.T program, which is a tuning back to our feelings from some of our numbness and psychic paralysis, really, with so much fear in the world, and we're creating so much of it within our own worldview. Because it's not a healing worldview. We switched from a healing worldview to a coping worldview. Some people say, as my colleague Four says, perhaps 10,000 years ago. Others, like Riane Eisler, say maybe 5,000 years ago, we moved into a dominant culture from a partnership culture. These are backgrounds which I draw upon in the L.E.T program. I'm just letting you know, and some of the theorists and people, if you want to ask me more about that. But let me just share a bit within the field of philosophy. That there are some sources if you're interested to look at, but just to let you know where I'm coming from. So recently, one of the sources on understanding feelings beyond this sort of pop psychology, let's share our feelings. And yes, feelings are incredibly important if we want to move to this healing culture. It is someone like I call her recently the miserable old man, because as a person, Arthur Schopenhauer, this is 19th century, early 19th century, and writing into the mid 19th century when he passed away, was an academic philosopher who was really, in a sense, an existentialist of sorts. But really, when I'm discovering from his original writing in here, 1818, he's talking about tuning into the body, feelings of the body, and then the intuitional knowledge that comes from feelings. And he apparently is one of the first philosophers, I'll say at least in the Western world, and a very important one, with this radical move to the importance of feelings rather than everything being abstract, rational. And so I sometimes call feelings part of the irrational world, and of course can become part of the irrational realm of reality when the feelings are hurt feelings. Then we're into the irrational. But feelings themselves is really one of the core consistencies and parts of the irrational philosophy that I am promoting in the L.E.T program and in my work in general, in understanding how to manage fear better on this planet in a big way. Again, not a pop psychology way. So philosophers is where I go to rather than just psychologists and self-help psychology, pop psychology, because there's so much of that in North America. And people are feeding on this and consuming it and doing all the workshops. And not saying all bad, but to me often very shallow, because it doesn't help develop a philosophical basis to people in their understanding and developing of their own theory, and then practices from that theory, and then theory and practice leading to a good, healthy, and vibrant and legitimate praxis that is based on some solidity and not just a lot of trend. Okay, so I'm not big on trend. I've been around living on this planet too long to watch all the trends come and go, and people think this is going to be the answer, this is going to be the answer. So going back to feelings and the philosophy of feelings, at least back to the 19th century, when there was a major shift to attending, I'll call it the turn for feelings, the turn for the affective and the emotional world, and how that is so fundamental. So Schopenhauer was really important in affecting Friedrich Nietzsche and other philosophers that followed along that line of those thinkers, to realize that human beings are not fundamentally rational. We actually are fundamentally emotional, feeling, embodied, somatic beings. And often with a lot of irrationality when we're hurting and a lot of irrationality when we're just in our feeling mode, and that's that intuitive, sensing, connected mode with nature. As indigenous peoples in the pre-industrial world, we're so connected. So life enhancement training is about reconnecting with life, reconnecting with the natural that has been harmed, and that we haven't really told the people the truth about how important that natural feeling, primal world and intelligence and instinct, the intuitional knowledge. And we've sort of taken off, especially with the Industrial Revolution and science, with everything that's really important is empirical, scientific, rational, and the Enlightenment philosophies. Okay, so Schopenhauer comes out of the tradition of the Enlightenment philosophers, but by the 1800s, he was starting to challenge and critique it at a very fundamental level. So it was like philosophy in a new key. Thank you, Arthur Schopenhauer. And with Arthur Schopenhauer, this woman, philosopher, Susan Langer, very important in that not this only this book, Feeling and Form, which is kind of her theory of art and aesthetics. Prior to this book was her real breakthrough book in 1932. So we moved from 1818 forward to 1932 with a major philosopher. She wrote Philosophy in a New Key. And not only that, she was a woman, which really intrigues me as an important juncture within philosophy in the West to bring back feeling as central. And that, so Philosophy in a New Key was her starting to do that in her unique way, and no doubt spinning off of Schopenhauer and others. I'm not an expert and I'm not a professional philosopher to give you the full course on that trajectory of how that became important. So we're moving to this world of feelings. I come then to the most powerful book I've read on feelings and its importance to, by again, a philosopher who then wrote a book on psychology. And I will read a bit from his book. This is John Heron, Feelings and Personhood, Psychology in a New Key. And he was certainly picking off of Susan Langer from the 1930s. This is the 1990s. And this is a book that just most everybody has never heard of John Heron, very few people in the margins. I was lucky enough to be guided to John Heron's work through the Peer Counseling, Liberation Peer Counseling, the Co-Counseling International movement, which he was part of founding, which is the peer counseling that is the fundamental part of the second aid within the L.E.T program. So I'm sharing a lot here, and I realize I'm kind of moving through to get the video done, but you can go back and check other videos and get refreshing on these concepts and ideas. And you can see there's a vocabulary and language that's really important to me. I'm a curriculum designer by profession, so I structure things very carefully with a philosophical basis that has consistency to it. Again, beyond just a trendy psychology and things to do as practices that are cool. John Heron, really important. I think he's probably in his last years of life right now, probably. I wish him the best. He's had an amazing life of influencing the peer counseling world and philosophy, going down this new key with the psychology down the new key. And just very briefly, his picture of his 4 modes of knowing, which is a really holistic, beautiful model of connecting life and mind. And of course, life and body is in there too. He doesn't pull it out in this diagram, he's just simplified it. But what I wanted you to pay attention to is, the 4 different modes of knowing. And right here, equally important is the affective mode. And that's actually, when you read the book, his primary focus. So he's a philosopher of feelings, and in a very rich, deep way. So feelings can also be, and the affective domain is sort of the largest umbrella. Feelings is kind of a smaller umbrella. And then within feelings is in emotions, another umbrella. And there is a movement within Western philosophy, study of philosophy of the emotions, but often does not have this really radical typically does not have this really radical philosophy shift of centralizing hurt, feelings, and feelings, period, and this emotional affective domain. So again, I'm giving you philosophers who've really centralized it and are quite radical in doing that. So this brings to the L.E.T program, one of the things I told the students right at the very beginning is if somebody asks you, well, what kind of course are you taking, what's it about, you could just say, I said to them, well, just call it emotional fitness. Yeah, you're going to a course on emotional fitness, and Dr. Fisher is teaching it, and it will give you more capacity to have more free attention. Very important word in the L.E.T program. And in John Heron's work, where a lot of this foundationally has been worked out, as well as the work of Harvey Jackins and others, many others, in the peer counseling liberation movements. And that's what I follow. That's what I was trained in early on, and really still teach and love the work because it's so important on how we're hurt and how we heal. But this is the simple language when people relate to today is emotional fitness. And the other term is, John Heron's is emotional competency. And just before I read his view, I want to read a bit on his notion of emotional competency, and in this great book, Feeling and Personhood. I want to say, emotions in the emotional turn or the affective turn has become part of academic studies in the last 20 years or so, maybe even 30 actually. And that's great. And I also want to say it's very small, or it's very marginal, and it's also not what a lot of people want to see in the big rational world. They can't think that it's all that important. Okay, we'll deal a little bit with it and give you a little bit of attention and so on, support, but really not a fundamental shift or centralization on human nature as ultimately irrational. And that takes a whole other course of action and a place of moving out, especially from, our fundamental way of relating to each other is affective. And ideas are important, and rational is important in that, and cognitive and so on, but affective is central, and I think that's what's tearing our world apart fundamentally, is hurt feelings not being attended to because we don't notice them. That's why violence is so important, why we're not a nonviolent society of cooperation. We're more of competition and domination. So emotional competency, let me briefly just give a few pieces from John Heron. Emotional competence is one of the hallmarks of the self-creating person. So his fundamental philosophy of personhood, John Heron, starts with this notion of emotional competence. It means that a person who has it is able to manage their emotions awarely in terms of the basic skills of control, expression, catharsis, and transmutation, plus one or two others. He has a very complex philosophy and theory and set of theories about emotions and emotional competence. Our society is emotionally repressive. Bingo. Let me even stop there. There's so much I love about this work. And he talks about emotional education and training. He says there just is no given priority to the wounded child. So that's his next sentence. And I could just go on and on. And we don't have a healing model. Why he's saying is all these things is because of his experience for many, many years and many other people's experience, studying and following this tradition of feelings, and it's important as a shift in the way we need to think and revise, completely transform our priorities and make feelings really important, because hurt feelings will continue to cause the damage they are and the violence they are doing and the ignorance and the arrogance and the toxicity, etc., etc. So we get to emotions. One of the problems we've had in this rational, scientific, cognitive, technological world is some people are recognizing, like Daniel Goleman came out with the book Emotional Intelligence. EI. And that took off, and Dalai Lama supported that. It was a big movement back in the 90s, and still carrying on, and schools picked it up and put it in with their social, emotional development. They could see kids are really being raised in some strange ways in our society, including the digital TV world and so on, and parents working way too many hours and to try and survive, and a world of economic drivenness, that the child is really being sacrificed here, their emotional development. So that was the idea of the psychology of emotions, Daniel Goleman being one of the big leaders and very popularized the movement. It's also been criticized. I've criticized it. Many scholars have criticized that movement on some of its real shadow default side. And one of it is that it doesn't start with our society is emotionally repressive. And I know John Heron's work, he would say, our society is an oppressive society. It is a fear-based society. And that's our Michael Fisher adding in pieces to that. We are a coping culture, not a healing culture. And this has caused great damage through our socialization and education, which is completely inadequate. Emotional education, I find very, very narrow, top level, superficial. That's another video, another critique. Let me give you some of his qualities. He lists about, I think, 12 of them, so I'm barely going to even touch just a couple. But he calls it a vast social pathology, and these are some of the competencies that would help us unravel that pathology and really bring this truth and reconciliation on the larger scale back to recovering our natural healers, our natural sense of self, our feelings that are not all based on hurt, that drive and force and push us into irrational behaviors way more than is helpful. Emotional competence means many things. One, it validates both positive emotions and distress emotions. Two, it sees the catharsis of distress emotion as evidence of self-healing, not as evidence of breakdown. So all of those emotional distress, crying, shaking, trembling, yawning, sweating, I could go on with the natural ways we discharge, or catharsis, have a cathartic experiencing process occur. This reframes it. Emotional competence reframes all of that as not, oh, there's something wrong with you. You know, why are you crying so much, or so on. And that, you know, the whole mental health world and the way we conceptualize mental health needs to be revisioned around this philosophy core of shifting. And it has not done that for the most part. It tries a little bit on the surface, the mental health world, medical world, but it's so not emotionally competent, as are the practitioners, in my experience of 40 years working in the emotional health field, mental health field, education field, human services. Most of the people who are at the head of those organizations and operations and structures are not very emotional competent. They would not meet many of these criteria. As I said, 12 to 15, I think he lists. So self-healing is so important, and it differentiates between distress emotions as such from the disturbed, distorted forms it acquires after it has been repressed and denied. So that's the hurt feelings, the denial of our natural healers. And again, that's like 3 out of many other aspects to his emotional competence. So L.E.T training is about building emotional competence, and that's why I said we should all be, after the L.E.T program, wearing this on our t-shirt, or as kind of just a metaphor for, this is what I'm working on, my emotional competency, emotional fitness. I'm into emotional fitness. Just imagine if we put the dollars, emphasis, value on emotional fitness on every street corner. Like, you know, in some of the cities, almost it feels like there's a workout, you know, facility for physical fitness, and a massive $1 billion plus market growing and growing on physical fitness. Yeah, it's useful and helpful, but it's like in John Harrow's model, if you only look at the physical world and not the affective world, and you only look at the mental world and not the intuitive world or the abstract world, that's why we need a model that balances. And we could adopt this politically. The society just has to say, yeah, we want better balance. We want to actually balance those out, and we'll do a lot better as a society. We'll be more innovative, more productive. People will not be so distressed, not using up so much money on the health systems because they're just going to be healthier. And Marianne Williamson in her 2020 bid for the presidency, she's talking about this kind of complete reconciliation of the holistic human. And we can actually build from government all the way down, plus people building that model from the bottom half, which is a lot of the well-being and health industry and people who have been talking about holistic models. So, but we need to get that at the governmental level. You see, that's what we're not doing. So emotional competency on one side of the t-shirt, and on the other side, existential capacity. So I've just briefly introduced this in the course, and I'm exploring what this means. And I will say that it's going to be on the back of the t-shirt because it's one that's not so common to us, and it's one that is much more difficult to build a competency with, a capacity on. And it involves, as you even heard, I talked about existential philosophy. So that's the philosophical part of the gain or the goal, is to develop, as I say, this competency that I shared a very brief definition, which is not inadequate. It's inadequate, sorry, but it's gives a feel of the senses to be able to move into and face into fear, terror, panic, death, extinction, collapse, the falling apart, the destruction, and the creativity that goes with that without falling apart. If you are fully building an emotional competency with the existential capacity, and that requires, again, this kind of mind shift, existential revisioning, restructuring. The healing process itself has a quality of deconstructing and falling apart in a certain way from that rational, controlled, everything's up here, okay, I'm doing fine, we'll be okay, we'll hold it together. Existential and emotional capacities or intelligences move down to a much deeper core developmental level and centering of our competency and capability to handle anything in that sort of sense. It's not like being a superhero and that sort of stereotypic idea of the courageous, brave can handle it all. Parts of that are partially true and partially a great goal for the, quote, heroic part of ourself, our more competent, really powerful spiritual self, even some people would call. But I'm not trying to create a caricature or a stereotype, and not trying to market that as has been done in this kind of pseudo faux notion of the altogether person, the enlightened one, etc. You can see I take this very different approach with emotional competency, existential capacity. And that's what we're working with in the L.E.T program. Much more to be said about all of those, and I'm looking forward to, if you have comments or want to create a discussion with me, if you want to take a class, again, you can send me an email at r.michaelfisher52@gmail.com, and I have my work all over the internet and my email and so on. So we'll leave it there for today. Thank you for following through with me to get to these powerful points I'm making. And let me just give my one quick idea on, very practically, of how to build a nonviolent society. It would be based on a healing model and a feeling-centered philosophy. And it would look like, in the most simple way, is that in every family, every organization, every relationship, there would be a cooperative spirit of, let's create a little table where we put a feather on the table that represents symbolically that when somebody has a requirement, a desire for attention, when they have distress, when they have hurt feelings, that they can pick up the feather and walk down through the corridors, show it to their partner, show it to their parents, show it to their children. Everybody can use it. That's the rule. And when somebody's got the feather, the basic rule is that people stop at what they're doing and they give a certain amount of attention, and that can be actually worked out in time. I use a timer in the training that I do in the L.E.T program. Even 1 minute, 2 minutes, and maybe more, depending on the situation and the organization, the type of structure. And when they get that unconditional attention, that person with the feather can do whatever they want to get without harming anybody or themselves. They just get that attention. They stop the world in a sense. And we become a feeling society again. We renew, right? Like a ritual, we renew, and we have to do this. That's why rituals are part of the universal in all cultures, is to renew what we're starting to forget and slip away from, to renew us back to our natural condition, which would be a natural healing that would come from that unconditional attention. That's the theory and the model. And that would lead to people not operating from that irrational hurt feeling, and that would undermine violence of virtually all kinds. Very simple gesture, very simple thing to do, doesn't cost any money. This could be instituted as an entire cultural ritual within the world of healing, liberation, truth, and reconciliation. Thanks very much for listening to this today. Bye now.